the impact, and the need to understand the origins of conflicts. Have you ever wondered how the first wars and human disputes began? Or why violence, which started with simple disputes over food and territory, evolved into the great conflicts that have marked the history of civilizations? Understanding the origins of conflicts is not just a historical question, but an essential key to comprehending human behavior, social structures, and even the wars that still affect our modern world. In this video, we will explore how conflicts, initially based on basic survival needs, transformed into organized wars that helped shape the first civilizations. From the struggle for scarce resources, we moved to the rise of empires, where war became a tool of power, expansion, and social organization. You will understand how these clashes, seemingly instinctive and chaotic, influenced the birth of complex societies with governments, religions, and economic systems. Moreover, throughout this journey, we will discuss the lessons that the history of wars offers us and how they still resonate in our current world. Why is it important to look to the past? Because by understanding the reasons and consequences of the first conflicts, we can not only gain a better understanding of the formation of civilizations, but also reflect on how the tensions of the past still influence international relations and contemporary disputes. Stay with us to understand how these early moments of violence and survival transformed into one of the greatest drivers of human history and how this shaped the world we know. The survival instinct. The first human conflicts. The history of the first human conflicts begins with what is perhaps the most primal and basic impulse of all, the struggle for survival. When our ancestors began to form the first groups, the competition for essential resources such as food, water, and shelter was a matter of life or death. Nature, ruthless and unforgiving, dictated that the most adaptable or strongest would prevail, leading to violent confrontations between human groups. In the early stages of human evolution, individuals lived in small, often nomadic groups, relying on their hunting and gathering skills to sustain the community. When a group encountered a territory rich in resources, it would naturally attempt to defend it against any other threat. This defense was not only against natural predators, but also against other human groups that, like them, sought to secure their own survival. This cycle of competition for resources generated simple but ongoing conflicts. Archaeological studies show us that in some of the earliest human settlements, signs of violence such as wounds caused by rudimentary weapons and skeletons exhibiting battle marks indicate that disputes over territory and food were not uncommon. Even before the emergence of great civilizations, there was a constant need to protect what was considered essential for the survival of the group. These conflicts were, at their core, about immediate and basic needs, but they represented the seed of something larger. The creation of more complex social structures, where disputes could be more frequent and organized. As the struggle for resources intensified, especially in regions with limited natural resources like riverbanks and fertile plains, violence became a tool for ensuring the continuity of the group. However, these initial conflicts were not just destructive. They helped form the first bonds of unity within groups and encouraged the development of social and organizational skills. The small disputes that began as confrontations for resources would soon evolve into something more structured, with the need to defend not only territory, but also the identity and values of the group. From spontaneous violence to social organization, the beginning of power structures. As human groups became more complex and their interactions more frequent, spontaneous violence began to give way to more organized forms of confrontation. The struggle for resources and territory was no longer limited to random clashes between individuals or small groups. It began to involve entire communities and, later, entire societies. This process of social organization was one of the main milestones in the evolution of human relations, transforming conflicts into instruments of power, authority, and control. With the increase in populations and the scarcity of resources, small tribes began to organize in a more structured manner. The concept of leadership emerged as a necessity to coordinate defenses against rival groups, resolve internal disputes, and make strategic decisions. These early leaders, often based on combat skills, wisdom, or family lineage, began to centralize power and responsibility for the well-being of the group. It was in this context that the first social hierarchies emerged, leaders began to be recognized not only for their physical strength, but for their ability to manage conflicts and resources. These leaders, who could be tribe chiefs or more experienced warriors, became key figures in organizing the group's defenses, consolidating their power and influence. This process of social organization was also fundamental to the emergence of the first forms of government and justice. Instead of resolving everything through direct violence, societies began to develop more refined ways of conflict resolution. The concept of justice arose from a practical necessity. Internal conflict within a group could be as destructive as external conflict. Thus, leaders began to implement rudimentary systems of judgment and punishment, establishing norms that helped ensure the cohesion and survival of the group. However, the role of leaders was not limited to internal management. As competition for resources increased, confrontations arose with neighboring groups or rival tribes. Leadership expanded into a broader context of territorial expansion and defense against external invasions. This led to the creation of organized armies, initially in a rudimentary form, but over time becoming more sophisticated structures, with specialized soldiers and more complex combat tactics. Thus, as conflicts between groups became more frequent and societies more organized, war began to be seen not only as a struggle for survival, but as a strategic tool for ensuring the power and prosperity of the group. It was the beginning of a new era, where violence no longer existed merely as a spontaneous phenomenon, but as a shaping force of social and political structure. The evolution of weapons, technology, and violence in the ancient world. With the advancement of human societies and the increasing complexity of conflicts, technology played a fundamental role in transforming warfare. The development of new weapons and combat techniques was one of the main factors that altered the dynamics of conflicts, allowing small groups of warriors to transform into organized and highly effective armies. War, which had previously relied on brute strength, increasingly depended on intelligence, strategy, and technological innovation. In the early periods of human history, weapons were simple and made from natural materials such as stones, bones, and wood. The first combat tools, such as clubs and spears, were essential for hunting and self-defense, but also became instruments of aggression against other human groups. These early artifacts are remnants of an era when violence was still raw and unpredictable, but no less impactful. As ancient civilizations began to develop, especially in the fertile regions of Mesopotamia and Egypt, war became a central aspect of social and political organization. In these contexts, the evolution of weapons was accelerated by the need to protect territory, conquer new lands, and ensure the subjugation of neighboring peoples. The invention of the bow and arrow, for example, allowed ancient armies to attack from a distance, completely changing the dynamics of battles. No longer limited to hand-to-hand combat, warriors could reach distant enemies, making confrontations more deadly and strategic. The advancement of metallurgy also had a significant impact. The use of metals such as copper and bronze in the manufacture of weapons, such as swords, axes, and helmets, gave armies much greater destructive power. The first bronze swords, for example, were fundamental to the military success of civilizations such as the Egyptians and Hittites. The transition from bronze to iron later revolutionized warfare even further, producing more durable and efficient weapons. In addition to weapons, technology also played a crucial role in the evolution of military tactics. The invention of chariots of war and later catapults and siege machines increased the attack and defense capabilities of ancient civilizations. War began to involve not only brute force, but also the strategic use of resources and technological innovations to conquer and maintain power. These technological advances not only increased the lethality of conflicts, but also transformed the nature of societies. Over time, control over weapon production and the capacity for technological innovation became a sign of power. Civilizations such as the Egyptians, Assyrians, and Persians, with their well-equipped armies, were able to conquer vast territories and establish empires that lasted for centuries. The first civilizations, war as a tool for expansion and domination. As the first civilizations began to emerge, War ceased to be merely a form of defense or survival and became a deliberate instrument of expansion and domination. Empires began to be built on military strength, and war became a fundamental tool for ensuring control over vast territories, dominating other peoples, and securing valuable resources. Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, and other great ancient civilizations realized that war was not just a matter of defense, but a way to consolidate and amplify political and economic power. The city-states of Mesopotamia, such as Ur and Babylon, were among the first to systematically use war to expand their domains. War as a tool for conquest became essential to ensure the survival of these urban centers, which competed with each other for natural resources, such as fertile lands and access to trade routes. The Akkadian and Babylonian empires, for example, grew thanks to successful military campaigns that resulted in vast territories under their control. King Sargon of Akkad, one of the greatest conquerors of Mesopotamia, is a classic example of how war was used to establish and maintain an empire. In Egypt, war was also a tool for expansion, especially during the periods of the New Kingdom, 1550 to 1070 BC, when pharaohs sought to conquer lands beyond Egypt's traditional borders. Military campaigns led by Pharaoh Thutmose III, for instance, expanded Egypt's borders into Syria and southern Palestine, which not only increased available resources but also ensured control over important trade routes. War, therefore, was essential for sustaining the pharaoh's power and ensuring the prosperity of the empire. Furthermore, war played a central role in unifying peoples under a single dominion. Control of large territories through military conquest not only secured resources, but also helped consolidate the authority of leaders and dynasties. Unification through war allowed for the creation of empires, where rulers could centralize power, establish administrative systems, and ensure internal security. The strategic use of war for expansion and domination brought with it new social and political dynamics. Conquered populations were often subjugated, forced into labor, or taken as prisoners of war, and these practices resulted in the creation of a rigidly structured social hierarchy. Societies also began to develop more sophisticated forms of administration and governance, often directly influenced by the military needs of the empire. War and the formation of religions and mythologies. As conflicts became a central part of life in the early civilizations, they began to profoundly influence the belief systems and mythologies of ancient societies. War, in many cases, was not seen merely as a clash between humans, but also as a manifestation of divine forces. This connection between religion and war helped shape the cultural identities of civilizations and reinforce the legitimacy of their leaders, who were often seen as chosen by the gods to lead their people to victory. In early civilizations such as Mesopotamia and Egypt, war gods occupied central positions in religious pantheons. In Mesopotamian cultures, for example, the god Ninurta was revered as a deity of war and protection, symbolizing the strength needed to protect and expand a city-state's territory. Similarly, the Egyptians believed that pharaohs were divine leaders, incarnations of Horus on earth, and that their military conquests were an extension of the will of the gods. War, in this sense, was sacred, a mission blessed by the deities. In addition to justifying war, religions also helped explain victories and defeats on the battlefield. Defeat was often interpreted as divine punishment, while victory was seen as a sign of favor from the gods. This narrative reinforced the power of ruling elites, who could claim that their leadership was aligned with divine will. On the other hand, losing battles often led to political crises, as rulers could be questioned regarding their legitimacy. War also played an important role in the creation of the founding myths of civilizations. Epic narratives such as the Epic of Gilgamesh in Mesopotamia or the myths of Osiris and Seth in Egypt often incorporated elements of conflict and battle to symbolize the struggle between order and chaos, life and death. These stories not only justified wars as necessary to maintain divine order, but also helped create a collective identity for societies. Finally, the association between religion and war perpetuated a heroic view of conflicts, where warriors were glorified as instruments of the gods. This idealization shaped the culture and imagination of early civilizations, perpetuating the belief that war was ultimately a legitimate tool for fulfilling greater purposes, whether they were religious, political, or cultural. The impact of wars on the development of early economies. As early civilizations used war as a means of conquest and territorial expansion, the very economic dynamics of these societies were profoundly shaped by conflicts. War, far from being merely an event of destruction, was also a transformative force that drove economic innovations and established the foundations for the first large-scale trade and production systems. Initially, war demanded a massive amount of resources: food, weapons, materials for building fortifications, and, of course, labor. The first armies, composed mainly of peasants and tribal warriors, needed to be fed and equipped, leading to the development of organized supply and logistic systems. This forced civilizations to create a more complex economic infrastructure capable of sustaining prolonged military campaigns. In Mesopotamia, for example, the resources needed to feed armies and sustain conquest warfare were one of the driving forces behind the development of trade. The Mesopotamian city-states competed for scarce raw materials, such as copper for weapons and tools, and wheat, which was essential for supplying the troops. As a result, trade routes were expanded, and the economy diversified. Merchant caravans became vital not only for internal trade, but also for maintaining military campaigns, ensuring that resources reached the centers of power. Moreover, military campaigns also spurred the adoption of more efficient agricultural techniques. When an empire conquered new lands, the agricultural production of those regions had to be reorganized to sustain the armed forces and the local population. The need to ensure food for large armies led to the introduction of new agricultural technologies, such as large-scale irrigation and the use of more advanced tools. However, war also brought about a new economic concept: the creation of tributes and taxes. The conquest of lands led empires to implement systems for collecting taxes from subjugated populations, establishing a steady flow of resources for the rulers. This not only sustained the war machines, but also enabled the financing of large infrastructure projects, such as palaces, temples, and fortifications, which reinforced the power of the empire. Additionally, slavery and the plundering of resources from conquered populations became integral parts of the imperial economy. Thousands of prisoners of war were forced to work in fields, mines, and construction projects, creating a cheap and abundant labor base. This system was widely utilized by empires like Rome, which exploited slave labor to further expand its economy. In summary, wars not only shaped politics and society, but also drove the economic development of early civilizations, creating new markets, new forms of production, and new trade relationships that lasted for centuries. Wars as a driver of military and strategic innovation. As ancient empires grew and civilizations expanded, military conflicts evolved not just in scale, but also in sophistication. The need to adapt to an increasingly complex and competitive warfare environment led to the development of new tactics, strategies, and technological innovations. Wars became a catalyst for innovation, with each new conflict requiring the creation of more efficient and powerful solutions to ensure victory. The development of advanced military tactics was one of the most notable areas of this evolution. The use of infantry, cavalry, artillery, and eventually siege machines, such as catapults and siege towers, transformed the battlefield. Early military strategies were based on simple formations and guerrilla tactics, but over time, more organized techniques emerged. The Egyptian army, for example, employed specialized units for different types of combat, while the Assyrian forces were known for their effectiveness in siege tactics and rapid invasions. In ancient Greece, especially during the Punic Wars, the ability to combine various combat units, such as the heavy infantry phalanx, cavalry, and naval fleets, was perfected, making the Greek army a model of strategy. The famous Battle of Marathon, for example, demonstrated the effectiveness of a strategic combination of infantry and naval maneuvering, marking a milestone in military development of the time. One of the most important innovations, however, was the use of psychological warfare. Over time, it became clear that war was not merely a matter of brute force, but also of morale and intelligence. Empires like Rome began to utilize military propaganda and manipulation of public opinion to weaken enemies even before confrontations began. The use of messages, banners, symbols, and even intimidation rituals were ways to undermine resistance before battles commenced. These psychological warfare methods were decisive in the conquest of vast territories and the maintenance of large empires. Technological innovation also played a crucial role in the evolution of warfare. The early siege weapons, such as battering rams and siege towers, were created to destroy the walls of fortified cities, leading to the development of new defense techniques, such as buttresses and thicker walls. The use of the bow and arrow, the introduction of iron spears, and improved metallurgy for the manufacture of swords and armor changed the dynamics of conflicts, enabling armies to become more efficient and lethal. As wars advanced, civilizations began to recognize the importance of strategically preparing resources, not just troops. Logistics to ensure that supplies, food, and weapons reached armies at the right time became a vital part of military strategy. The establishment of secure trade routes, the creation of military supply chains, and the construction of fortifications became priority issues during wartime. Thus, war was not merely a destructive practice. It was a testing ground for military innovations that, over time, spread to other areas of civilian life. Tactics, techniques, and inventions born on the battlefield formed the foundations for ancient civilizations and directly influenced how empires governed and protected their territories. The social consequences of war, the impact on family structures, and the role of women. War affects not only the battlefield and politics. Its consequences reverberate throughout the social and family structures of a society. As ancient empires expanded and conflicts intensified, social dynamics and traditional roles within communities underwent significant transformations. War, with its constant demand for human and material resources, profoundly altered the daily lives of people, particularly concerning family structures and the role of women in societies. The first major change brought about by war was the alteration of family structures. When large portions of the male population were called to military service, women and children often assumed the responsibility of managing the household, agriculture, and other essential tasks. This represented a stark contrast to traditional gender divisions, where men were predominantly providers and warriors, and women were seen as responsible for maintaining the home. During wartime, however, women often needed to engage in economic, agricultural, and even defense activities to ensure their family's survival. War also led to the creation of new roles for women in society. In some ancient civilizations, women were trained to act as warriors, strategists, and military leaders. A notable example is the figure of the Amazons in Greek mythology, although there are also historical records of real women, such as warrior queens, who played active roles in military campaigns. In other contexts, women like the Spartan women in Greece were instructed from a young age to be physically strong and to take on supportive roles in military campaigns, ensuring the strength and resilience of society during men's absence. In terms of broader family impacts, war often resulted in the loss of husbands, fathers, and sons, creating enormous social and economic instability. Widows and orphans frequently faced extreme hardships, as without the protection of men, they became more vulnerable to exploitation and poverty. Some cultures, however, instituted measures to ensure the survival of these individuals, such as the establishment of foundations for the widows and children of fallen warriors or the distribution of land and resources to affected families. Another important aspect of the social consequences of war was the formation of a class system based on victims and survivors. In some cultures, prisoners of war were enslaved or forced to work for the conquering empire, resulting in the growth of servant or slave populations within empires. Women, in this case, were often the most affected, being captured and forced to work in fields, mines, or even as domestic slaves. Finally, war had a significant impact on the relationship between different social classes. The elites who benefited from military conquests often saw their power amplified, while the lower classes, especially those directly involved in the war effort, experienced great losses and hardships. The lack of male labor due to wars resulted in a reorganization of social functions, with women often taking on roles and responsibilities that, in peacetime, would have been unthinkable. Therefore, the social consequences of war were profound and far-reaching. War transformed family dynamics, redefined social roles, and contributed to the evolution of class structures within ancient civilizations. Throughout history, the impact of war on social life and the position of women remains a fundamental aspect of understanding the true nature of societies in times of conflict. The influence of war on the art and culture of ancient civilizations. War, with its victories and tragedies, not only shaped the political and social structures of ancient civilizations, but also had a profound impact on cultural, artistic, and literary expressions. Conflicts and conquests were grandly represented in various art forms, reflecting both the pride of victories and the scars left by destruction and suffering. War, as one of the greatest drivers of human history, permeated the narratives, sculptures, paintings, and even music of ancient civilizations. In Greece, the art of war was exalted in monuments and literary works. The Parthenon in Athens, for example, is filled with sculptures that depict mythical and real battles, such as the famous Amazon Wars and the Persian Wars. These representations were not only a way to glorify the feats of heroes, but also to reinforce the power and superiority of the Greek city-states, especially Athens, which saw itself as the protector of Greek civilization against external threats. In particular, the work The Judgment of Paris, which portrays a mythological conflict between gods and heroes, symbolizes the intersection between human and divine conflicts. Literature also played a crucial role in shaping public perception of war. Homer's Iliad, one of the greatest epic works of Western literature, is a detailed account of the Trojan War, a confrontation of enormous importance to Greek mythology. The work not only glorifies the heroes of war, such as Achilles and Hector, but also explores complex issues of honor, revenge, and suffering, highlighting the human and destructive side of conflict. The Odyssey, also by Homer, describes the return of Odysseus after the war, a narrative that brings to light the difficulties and traumas that warriors faced upon returning home, offering a more complete view of the impact of war on the human psyche. In ancient Egypt, art was used both to celebrate military victories and to assert the power of the pharaoh. Egyptian temples and pyramids often depicted scenes of victorious battles and military conquests, such as those of Ramses II against the Hittites in the Battle of Kadesh. These images were used to reinforce the authority of the pharaoh, portraying him as a divine leader chosen by the gods to protect Egypt and expand its borders. Egyptian art, with its emphasis on order and eternity, sought to immortalize victories and give a sense of immortality to rulers and their achievements. In Mesopotamia, military victories were often represented in stone stelae and bas-reliefs, such as the famous stele of Hammurabi, which depicts King Hammurabi receiving the law from the gods but also highlights his military capability. The Assyrians, known for their brutality in combat, produced large murals documenting their conquests, often showing scenes of torture and capture of prisoners of war. These representations not only glorified military strength, but also played a role in intimidation and control, reminding enemies of the brutality of the Assyrians. In addition to its propagandistic and glorifying function, the art of war also served to record the destruction and traumatic effects of conflict. Many artistic representations from wartime also depict the terrible consequences for civilians and soldiers. In Greek murals and ceramics, for example, there are depictions of prisoners being taken into captivity and scenes of destruction, illustrating the brutal reality of war, not just its glorification. Therefore, war was not only a defining element of ancient civilizations and political and social aspects, but also a fundamental theme in art and culture. War shaped how these civilizations viewed themselves and how they wished to be remembered by future generations. By looking at these representations, we can better understand the profound impact that military conflicts had on the formation of national identities, cultural construction, and the evolution of ancient societies.